So just very quickly back to our presenters. We have François Vermeulen, who's the head of our Technology Innovation Expert Group, Terry Orlick, the head of our Privacy Expert Group, and Ted Dunstan, who's the head of our Biometrics Security and Integrity Group, but also the founder of the Biometrics Institute. So I'm really pleased to have you all here. So we were going to start off the meeting just quickly with an introduction from me, and then we have our three speakers talk you through some of the good practices that we've been working on with our multi-stakeholder community to decide on how to implement biometric systems. And so they will talk a little bit about each section that this piece of work that we've put together, a report we're going to publish hopefully next month, is covering in a bit more detail. So let me just reminding people of the overall mission of the Biometrics Institute, which is the promotion of the responsible use of biometrics. And we are doing this in a truly independent, impartial, and international forum. So moving on, as I said, it is an international forum. We're covering 240 organizations. That's about 1,000 individuals from 30 different countries from around the world. So a wonderful community, and the membership splits into kind of three different categories: the users, the suppliers, and the academics. And on your screen on the slide, if you are joining us via the internet, you should be able to see those slides that outline some of the organization. Someone is saying I'm breaking up occasionally, so I apologize for that. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly dial in via the phone as well, because that makes the line a little bit more stable. So if you just give me a second, and then I'll come back into the call via the phone, just to make sure that while I move through the slides, the line doesn't break up. I'm showing you also a slide of the expert and sector groups, so you can see how basically the different committees are composed. I'll move on to the next slide. The guidelines, I just wanted to flag the Institute is working on different areas where we provide good practices to our members, and this is closely linked obviously to our overall mission on the responsible use. I won't go into the details. Terry will touch a little bit on this in his presentation. Also have developed some guiding material around the issue of vulnerabilities, and you can see on the screen there are three particular guiding documents that we have put together for our members: our top 10 vulnerability questions, a biometrics vulnerability checklist, and also a short guide, a baseline assessment guide on biometric vulnerabilities. Obviously, Ted will talk a little bit more about the subject of testing and vulnerabilities in his talk in a moment. Our work, which I mentioned at the beginning, our Understanding Biometrics Guide, reference guide, where we are looking at considerations for implementing a biometric system. We do want to point out that this is not yet another guide telling you how to go about implementing a biometric system. There are many books that have been written on this. This is really a document that's trying to put together the main steps in the process, and then really looking at referencing material that already exists, such as international standards guides or other good practice guides or books that are available. And so today's meeting will very much focus on this particular guide. That's what we've taken as the outline to talk you through today, through the different steps that we have identified together with our members as the good practices around biometrics. I currently have the latest version of this guide here in front of me. It's 25 pages, so quite concise and written in very simple terms. It's not for the experts, so the people who are presenting to you today probably don't need to read this guide very much, but it is certainly very useful for the people who are new to biometrics or who want to refresh their memory on biometrics. And as the Institute is engaging more and more with regions that are just really starting to come into the world of biometrics, this guide will be an extremely useful document to share with them. And that's obviously the work we are also doing with organizations such as the International Organization for Migration and also United Nations Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, with whom we are working on a compendium around good practices for the use of biometrics in counterterrorism. And with that, I will close at this point and will hand over to Francois to take us through the first section of these good practice recommendations, with an introduction and also some points on successful implementations. Someone is also asking, before I hand over, Francois, slides from this meeting. Absolutely, we will send out a PDF of these slides.
Great, thank you, Isabel. So thank you everybody for making time, as Isabel said, and let's jump right into it. We are only going to take a look at some of the items which is listed in the guide, and there's a lot more. Each of these points will obviously be covered in a lot more detail in the guide itself. The next slide, please, Isabel. Isabel, can we please get the next slide? Thanks. So if we are going to implement biometrics, it is important, as with all systems, to have a very clear and concise business case. Business case must clearly define the benefits of the biometrics, the risks associated, and the costs involved with implementing this. Some of the benefits might be as simple as just providing secure access for an employee, to improving a user experience when interacting with you, or even just ensuring that the person is the person that they say they are. Risk is a lot more complicated, and Terry will be touching on the privacy and security risks in a very short while. How will your biometrics link the identity securely to the biometrics which has been captured? How will we use these biometrics to identify a person, and what is the associated risks with this? How will we communicate these biometrics and all the rest? I mean, that's a major concern in today's digital age. Does your benefits which you have identified actually outweigh the risks? In today's economic environment, the cost effectiveness of any solution is obviously a prime consideration. Will the implementation of biometrics solve your problem with a cost-effective manner? It's important to bear in mind that you might require bespoke hardware and some additional network capacity when you're dealing with this. Might also require some custom development if it's a standard off-the-shelf solution is not available. Identifying these 3 steps at the start of the process can assist you immensely in having a successful implementation of biometrics. Next slide, please, Isabel.
Thanks, Francois. And that takes us onto the privacy section. So we'll bring in Terry now, and then actually, I think Ted was just asking me as he's passing through the airport lounge and has to board a flight next. I apologize, but we might just jump ahead to the vulnerability piece at the moment, if that's okay. And Terry will come back to you in a tick. So apologies for that, but we'll always keep very dynamic and agile here at the Institute. So I'm just going to quickly move through the next few slides, and then I'll bring on Ted, if that's okay. And Francois, you'll come back after Terry has done his privacy piece. So can have you unmuted, and then we'll jump to that first. Thank you.
Hi, Isabel. Thank you for that. Yes, wanted to talk today, obviously, about testing and assurance of biometric systems and why it's important. For those of you that are new to biometrics, you might think that buying a biometric system is like buying any other piece of IT, and you'll just read the back that says it's okay, and that it will work well for you. And that sometimes that can be the case, but in many circumstances, it's really important how the biometric system is going to operate for you, both from an accuracy perspective and also from a behavioral perspective. So testing with biometric systems is often difficult because it involves different biologies. Different people have different sorts of biometric signatures. Obviously, different people have different voices or fingerprints, and those differences can be based on demographics. So obviously, males and females, for instance, will respond differently and may even have different accuracy within a biometric system. Behavioral people who are used to using biometric systems are going to work differently from people that have never used a biometric system. This is called habituation, and there are all sorts of interesting behavioral effects which need to be considered in testing. Finally, environmental. Biometrics are in interface with the real world, and so they can be very affected by a whole range of different environmental conditions. For face recognition, things like light plays a huge place. For voice recognition, voice verification systems, there could be all sorts of issues to do with background noise, etc. And so when you're reading test results or testing output, it's important to understand how that testing has been done and how that testing relates to the particular type of environment which you are planning on using your system in. So there are four different types of tests, if you like. There's technical tests. Technical tests are done by standards organizations or testing organizations. So some examples of those would be the US NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, that runs a whole lot of tests on a variety of different biometric modalities, and is one of the most reliable sources of testing information. But there are others as well, so National Physical Laboratory in the UK, and a variety of other places around the world as well. So these tests give you some very good baseline information on the performance, on the general performance of algorithms. But to understand how they're going to work in your environment, there's another type of testing which is often done. It's called operational testing. And operational testing is where we basically make sure that the test is done in an environment which simulates very closely how you will be using the system. And so in that instance, we are looking to see exactly what your false accept rate, what your false reject rate is going to be, and how well that works with your users and in your particular environment. And finally, we've got scenario or ongoing testing. So once you have your system in place, the parameters might change. So for instance, if you're at an airport and you're running e-gates, there are a whole range of different factors that might change. Different lighting might change, sensors might fail, you might get different demographic groups going through. Many cases, for instance, e-gates have started to accept younger and younger clients, and age is a significant factor in accuracy for biometric systems. Planning ongoing testing can be important. There's a whole lot of terminology associated with biometric systems, and I'm not going to go through that terminology in detail here. There are some very good books and some good information on the web around it, but the basic terminology is the false accept rate, which is the rate at which people are falsely accepted into the system, and the false reject rate, which is the rate at which people that are meant to be accepted into the system, so valid users, are rejected. And the differences between the false accept rate and the false reject rate, every system has different settings and has different parameters, which are going to mean how you might adjust things in order to get a better or better false accept rate or a better false reject rate. Those two things are linked. There are also some other terms around failure to enrolls. And so, for instance, some people won't be able to use the system, many systems, because of specific medical conditions. So it's always important to understand what the limitations of any biometric system you're using are. Finally, I'll just mention about vulnerability. And vulnerability testing is a very specific type of testing. So most of the tests where we're looking at false accept rate and false reject rate are really focused very much around the generic accuracy. So if somebody is trying my mobile and they've just picked up my mobile and they're trying to break through the face recognition or fingerprint recognition, what's the chance of that happening? But imagine that I have an active attacker, which is the more likely scenario in, for instance, a border control context. So if I have an active attacker, they're going to take some care to try and directly look like somebody else or create an artifact which mimics somebody else. And that's what vulnerability is about. And so your false accept rate and your false accept rate doesn't measure directly how likely it is that somebody who is an active attacker is trying to bypass your system. And so active attacks might be people using masks, people using fake fingers. It could be as simple as people using dark glasses to avoid being picked up by face recognition systems. So it's an area of active interest, and there's a lot of development and additional terminology in that particular area. And I would advise people, if you're interested in some more details around that, the Institute has some additional resources beyond what will be in the best practice guide. So with that, I might hand that back to Isabel or to Terry.
Thanks, Ted. That's great and right on time. So we obviously want to leave a bit of room, and I can only encourage you to pose questions. I don't always get this group of experts together that could address any of the things that are on your mind. So feel free to type away in the chat function. And I know there's still people joining us, and as you come online, please make sure that you stay muted and that you have your web camera off. And then we'll move on to our next speaker. So I'm just going to move back. We had to change the agenda a little bit, obviously, but we'll just the section of this meeting. And obviously that is an area where the Institute has done a lot of work. I pointed out at the start of the meeting that we have this privacy guideline that was developed over many years now and reviewed every 2 years, but I won't go into more detail. Terry, our head of the privacy expert group, can I give you the floor? And don't forget to unmute yourself, and then we'll let you talk for the next 10 minutes a bit about some of the good practices around privacy. So thanks, Terry.
Thank you, Isabel. Good morning and good evening to people wherever you are around the world, which is a pretty fair reflection of the reach of the Biometrics Institute. That it's in virtually every continent and covers a significant number of very different countries. And that's relevant because when you get to privacy, there's a whole spectrum of how different countries, let alone different subcultures within those countries, view privacy. In some places, you can say that at a government level, that privacy is not an entirely important issue, that civil society needs to work on much greater controls over individual citizens. And at the other end, there are societies where the individuals are much more important than the state, and that privacy itself is much more important to individuals as part of their own self-identity and as voting citizens. Now, if we can look at how you prepare your privacy strategy, let's get down to some practical things. I've tried to put it all in essentially 3, 4, 5 sentences, but each sentence I think contains some pretty important words. So let's take them bit by bit, as someone describes it, an entomological journey. I hate the word, but at least it gets down to square one. First of all, design. You must design your privacy policies into your systems. So regardless of whether you're talking to the people who are owning the systems, the end customers, or the managers in your system, you need to work through every issue in privacy from day one. It's not something you tack on halfway through the process when you say, gee, wouldn't it be good if we could save money in our bank by having everyone move away from ATMs, that is public funding machines in the street, to doing things online and making it more secure by, for example, asking them to provide a fingerprint. And that might sound very good. It might sound that it's an effective way to cut costs for the bank, and it might, in theory, give the consumer greater privacy protection, since they're not just using a PIN number, but they may also be using a biometric. So designing privacy right in at the beginning, at the very first meeting about what you want to do when you're looking at the introduction of a biometric, is absolutely critical. And then the second point is maintaining that environment which you eventually create, that is a trusted privacy environment, where your customers or your clients or whoever you describe, for example, users of government services, their view right through to what you would feel about yourself as an organization, that's to do with maintenance, whether it's the technology, the procedures, the training of your staff, the audits that you do from time to time to make sure that your policies are right and your practices are right. All of that is part of maintaining your trusted environment. In fact, I put it this way, there's no point in buying a Rolls Royce if, like my grandmother, for 30 years, you never had it serviced. She didn't have a Rolls Royce, by the way, she had a Ford. But for nearly 30 years, she never changed the oil. It never had a service, but it ran for 30 years. But ultimately, it ended up in flames because lack of maintenance. And so when you look at your privacy environment, you can design privacy in, you need to maintain it during the period of time through audits, etc. And in the last phrase, you also need to make sure that privacy is owned at the highest level of your organization. There is no point in giving it to someone who's struggling down in the legal department of your organization and saying, by the way, you're now managing privacy. That's not good enough. Privacy has to be signed off at the top executive level, and not only signed off, but overseen from time to time. And in fact, the measurement of that in a lot of the audits that we do of both government and private sector organizations is we say, how many times have you discussed privacy and security in your organization's executive meetings, i.e. at the top level of your organization. If it doesn't make it to the agenda, it does mean that your maintenance of a trusted privacy environment is not owned by those who ultimately make the major decisions and have the responsibility for for the privacy environment in your organization. So that's step one. When you plan, it's at the top of the tree in your organization, it's designed in, and you plan to maintain it from the very first day that you sign off on the design. There's no point in designing a great privacy environment if after that you spend no money and no time on making sure it's maintained properly. The next step is to read your relevant privacy legislation. There are a number of key privacy principles that no matter where you go in the world are likely to be important. One is consent. And it's especially important with biometrics because people are giving you something that is absolutely and utterly unique to them. Their fingerprint, their retina scan, their eye scan, their palm scan, whatever biometric you use, their voice, they are giving you something that belongs to them. The whole point about biometrics is that you're asking someone, either forcefully or otherwise, to give you something that is very, very unique. Therefore, you have a role of trust, which is given to you to handle that. The other one is retention. Around the world, you'll see that there are various views about retention, but you don't retain a biometric or personal data longer than you actually need to. The other one is securing personal data itself. If someone gives you their privacy, that is their biometric, for example, and the personal data that relates to that, you need to secure that personal data in every possible way. And if for some reason or other it breaks down, you aren't able to do it because there's a hacker that's got into your system, or some people in your organization have been clumsy, or there's been inadequate registration which has caused someone to be set aside, you need to be able to have in place a system which enables you to deal with those breaches very quickly and appropriately according to the legislation in your country. And then there's the right to be forgotten. In Europe, for example, with the EU, with the GDPR, their new legislation that comes into effect on May the 25th, there is a written right to be forgotten, i.e. if people say, I do not want my private information to be used by you or anyone else, they, within constraints, have a right to ask for that. And there's also a right to correct data in many countries, i.e. if you're, let's say, in the worst possible scenario, that'd be an incompetent scenario, but let's use that as an example, someone puts your name alongside someone else's biometric, and that causes all sorts of issues. You, in many countries, are allowed to correct that data, to ask what data is being kept on you, and to make sure that it's fixed promptly. Then there's the question of the transfer of data. The major rules around the world, generally speaking, say that if you transfer someone's personal data to another country for processing or storage or whatever, you must ensure that the legislation and the privacy rights in that other country, the receiving country, is as high as the country that has sent your personal data. That is written into the GDPR in Europe, it's written into the Australian and the United Kingdom rights of privacy in a number of other areas. And then there's exemptions. As Ted quite rightly said, there are some people who may not be able to have their privacy details and their biometric properly enrolled and used, because they might have hands that were damaged, they might have a voice which is, because of medical reasons, has changed since the enrollment, and various other variations. They might have problems in terms of religious viewpoints. you need to make provision for exemptions. Some legislation around the world is much tougher than elsewhere. But you need to read that first. And of course, if you're dealing with other issues like health, not only within your own country will you have privacy legislation, you will also have legislation and regulation which specifically applies to health issues. Because as we know, there are many health insurance companies that would dearly love to get hold of your genetic database to ensure that then when they set the risk management of whether they insure you or not, or whether they put a premium on your insurance, whether or not they have an accurate database to work with, if they have your details, then obviously it is much better for them, but not as good for you in terms of your privacy. So look at the privacy legislation, see what it involves. And if I could just make this one point about privacy legislation, you might think that reading the legislation only of your country is sufficient. If you happen to have, for example, now, any information from citizens of the EU, let's say you're based in Australia, the United States, the UK, Russia, or wherever, if you're trying to use that citizen's personal data and their biometric, you will need to ensure that you're doing the right thing by the GDPR, the General Privacy Regulation for the European Union, because that has a very wide international coverage. And by the way, the penalties for breaching it are enormous. It's 4% of the international turnover, or 20 million euro. That's the limit that you can be fined, but that is very significant. And you'll notice that international companies get drawn into this, no matter whether they're registered in the Bahamas, South America, Russia, or wherever, or the United States. They could still be under the coverage of the GDPR with those sorts of fines in place. So be very careful that you don't just stick to your own privacy legislation that relates to your country or your state, because there are others that have wide-reaching control. And the key one, of course, is before you even introduce a biometric, conduct a privacy impact assessment so that you know what your current environment looks like in terms of privacy, what your future business plans might do to that, and how privacy could be designed into those plans. Now, we are conducting through the Institute various workshops about how to make or conduct a PIA. Look for that news, because I think it is extremely useful for anyone, and it is in most cases written into the requirements of the privacy legislation in most countries. Now, for us at the Institute, we have designed the privacy guidelines with its 16 major principles and advice about how to implement them that sits over the top of all privacy legislation around the world. It's not superior to them. It's a way of saying, if you really want to be in world's best practice, then this is what you should be looking at. And it's based on the fact that our experts in the privacy education experts group, our people have looked at what is good privacy practice around the world, what is good privacy policy, and this is what we believe is the case. And as we know, IT, information technology, isn't restricted to one country. It is, in fact, an international thing, whether you like it or not. And finally, conduct regular privacy audits using an independent expert. And I use the word independent. Do not do it in-house. Ensure that the people who come in are ones who come in and say, this needs to be done, it must be done, please explain to me why it shouldn't be done, so that you do get an independent, objective viewpoint. And the regular privacy audits do what we said right at the beginning. It helps you maintain a trusted privacy environment. So we're here. Let me just remind you, Facebook has had some real issues because it struck privacy legislation, it struck authority kickback, it struck client kickback because of some of its practices. In Australia, for example, one of the major banks, and I'll finish on this point, lost the bank account details of 20 million clients, 20 million accounts, and they still don't know what happened to it. Now, you would never want to feature on the front page with that sort of loss at hand. And the last point I want to make is that the Prime Minister of Great Britain was having to apologise in the British Parliament for the loss of social welfare personal data of millions of people. And because the CD-ROM that contained those names and details had been lost, and he said it would never happen again. He had to get up in the House, Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister, and say, I'm sorry, it's happened again. So they lost both. Now, what does that tell you about how important it is to be careful about your privacy, even if it's for the protection of the reputation of your own organisation? Okay, thank you, everyone. I hope that that's been useful.
Thank you, Terry. That's great. Thank you very much. And we had some questions. I have mentioned there that the guidelines that we have developed are reviewed every 2 years, and the last review was last year, where we did look at the EU legislation, the GDPR, to make sure that we take that into consideration. Obviously, none of this is a guide on this is how exactly you should do it. They are recommendations from the Biometrics Institute that we have pulled together with that variety of members and experts that we have in our global network. But they're certainly a good starting point. So I would certainly encourage anyone, and if you're a member, you can get this guideline online. If you're not a member, you have to talk to us. Obviously, these are key member benefits of the Biometrics Institute. But yes, there's a wealth of knowledge. So I'm aware of time. And again, if you have any more questions, feel free to place them in the chat function. But Terry, that's been great. Thank you so much. And we might add that obviously many of the points that you have raised there are being addressed in the various gatherings that we have of our members. There is a privacy impact assessment workshop we are running in Australia and in London, and there are obviously various meetings. We held a Biometrics and GDPR seminar in Brussels recently, which was fascinating. So watch this space. So we had one question, and I know, Francois, we are bringing you back now, and maybe to that question as well, which was about different biometric modalities. So Francois, if I invite you back to talk us through the next section, and Ted, you're welcome to comment as well, but I'll give Francois the floor first, and then yeah, Ted, if you need to rush off to your next flight, do send us a little message and we'll let you come back. But Francois, over to you.
Thanks, Isabel. Thanks, Terry. Now that we've dealt with the most complex section, I can do the easy ones again. So when we look at modalities and the quality of each modality, there's so many available these days, and it's very important that you select the correct modality for your use case. All modalities, no matter what you decide on, does have strengths and weaknesses, and some of them might be quite, might have a massive impact on your implementation. How do we decide on the correct one? So when we start vetting modalities, it's important to consider a couple of things. The quality of the biometric once during enrollment. There's a lot of international image quality standards available. And it's important to bear in mind that vendors invest millions in research and development, not only to cater for things like liveness detection in their hardware, but also to ensure that their algorithms, which is created after enrollment, performs to the utmost fine-tuned performance. I mean, giving you seconds matching against millions of records. Even if you have decided on good quality hardware, your implementation can still be poorly done. So not only deciding on the hardware, but deciding on how it's implemented. Environmental factors like lighting, as Ted mentioned, you've got an e-gate and you've got spotlight shining into the camera. Things like that needs to be ensured or taken into consideration when you're deciding on the biometric modality that you're going to use. We've had a question about active biometrics. Now, it's firstly important to understand the difference between active and passive biometrics. Active biometrics will require the cooperation of a person. So anything where I require a person to place his finger, maybe provide a blood sample for DNA, that would be considered active. Passive is where the participant might not be aware that he's actually being identified. This can be the case in certain installations of face recognition, but obviously not all. So the benefit between the two is there really a benefit in regards to liveness detection or ensuring that the person is there using either or? And the answer currently is that it's very much obviously hardware dependent. As mentioned, a lot of investments gone into detecting liveness, not just blinking the eyes or ensuring that there's blood flow in the hand. There's a lot of tips and tricks that these vendors do in their hardware to ensure that the person is actually there and that it's not a spoofed attack that's trying to break into the system. Can we get the next slide, please, Isabel? When we're working with biometrics, it is very important to decide if you'll be working with the templates, which is the encoded versions of the images, or the images itself. Question always is, do I store both, or do I only select one and work with that specific modality's template, or work with that specific modality's image? Both has pros and cons associated with it, but if you are going to store the image as well, it does give you the added benefit of flexibility moving into the future, improvements of algorithms, interoperability between systems, but it also adds quite a lot of legal and privacy constraints and requirements and security to your implementation. Images, and as we all know, biometrics is not a secret. My face is my face, but anybody can see it. So it's important that you ensure your privacy and your security of your system is to the highest standard. Another thing to consider is, will your system need to cater for poor quality samples, or will all biometric transactions which is taking place in your system have optimally captured images of the biometrics that you would like to use? In certain instances, like your policing situations where you've got latent fingerprints that you're lifting, your system needs to be quite robust to be able to cater for matching of latent fingerprints against good quality prints which has been captured previously. Finally, we will be looking at the business model. if we look at biometrics, it is a very, very important technology, and it's probably best thought of as an enabler to the wider capability of identity management. It is thus very important to understand the holistic business process of identity management and how it can be best used. Creating a business model that takes the identity management process into account can prove a valuable point in your route to success. Ask yourself the following questions when you try to define this business model. How will I engage with my user? Will it be an active participation of the user? Will it be frictionless? Will the client just look into the camera and he will be identified? Will I require additional legal consent for the client to do this? What growth can be expected? Not just in volume of transactions as your system grows, but also in regards to the amount of users that you're interacting with. Will this system be self-contained? Will the system need to integrate into other systems? Am I allowing third parties to utilize this information? And then obviously, again, we're talking about the legal and privacy requirements, which you will then need to obtain to ensure that you can do this. Training is critical with any system. How am I going to train not only the users, but also the people who's managing, administrating, ensuring that the system is running? Defining business models can be challenging at the best of times, and biometrics is obviously no different. But we might have added complexities in regards to specialist roles, privacy expert, a biometric expert on specific modality that you've chosen, a legal expert ensuring that you comply to all the legal requirements, not just of your country, but cross borders. There's a massive global drive to ensure that organizations obtain data which is only fit for purpose and with informed consent of people that you're capturing the data of. Our guide aims to help you define these roles, define these items to ensure that you get a successful implementation. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Isabel.
Thanks, Francois. That's really interesting. And in a way, I wished we were now in a meeting face-to-face with everyone, because I would imagine that would really stimulate a very interesting discussion and a huge amount of questions. But this is meant to be a teaser for more that is there to come. So obviously we still have a little bit of time left. So I don't know if there are any more questions. I haven't received any here via the chat function. So now is the time to do that. But I know Ted had to leave us, so unfortunately he has to go off and catch the next plane. But Terry, were there maybe any more thoughts just listening to that, or any more comments on the guidance we can try and provide around any of those areas? Anything else that you would like to add, Terry?
Yes, Isabel, I think that the hardest problem for most people rolling out a system based on biometrics, or any system which uses unique personal identifiers, is to work out whether as an organization they're bound by their own country's legislation with regard to privacy, which can vary enormously from country to country, or whether they are bound because of the nature of information technology by wider laws or regulations. And I think I've tried to show that regardless of whether you like it or not, whether your own politicians like it or not, the GDPR privacy regime for the EU, in covering at least 27 countries and reaching out beyond Europe, is in fact a major determinant of where you should be with your privacy. And for example, in Australia and some other countries, you can be exempted from the Privacy Act of that country. If you're an organisation that turns over less than $3 million a year, or if you're a small organisation, or if you're the media, or if you're an outfit which covers the police. In Europe, most of those exemptions don't exist. So to believe that in Australia or the UK or Canada or wherever that you are exempted from legislation might be a real problem for you if you don't understand that a lot of your business may have something to do with the personal data of citizens in Europe. And I think a lot of American companies have been coming up against that particular issue. So you need to say to yourself, what exists in terms of the law for our country and our particular sector, whether it's health or law enforcement or whatever, or banks, and what exists elsewhere in the world that would force us to be compliant. And that is the most difficult decision for you to make. And sometimes my advice, my advice would always be to say, let's go for the highest level of privacy protection, which is obviously at the moment the GDPR.
Thanks, Terry. Obviously, what we need to keep in mind, and I realize we have 4 minutes left and people are starting to leave us, obviously, but an important thing to remember, and maybe Francois, if there's a final thought from you on that, we have lots of members and stakeholders in this biometrics community that are, as I said at the beginning, just coming into this biometrics space. And some countries where you know, privacy legislation might look quite different from what we are seeing in Europe or in the US. So, I mean, if you're new to this, well, obviously we have to say, come and join the Institute and learn and look at the guiding material. But what you said in on your last slide, the business case, that's really where you should start, shouldn't you? I mean, Francois, any final thought on that?
Yeah, I think defining the business case and the business model is probably the crux of the whole solution. Ensuring that your privacy complies to what is required if you're going to do biometrics, that will come in once you've decided, yes, biometrics is the way to go. It's the way that we would like to solve our burning issue, and then moving forward. We've noticed within our market a lot of companies who's selling hardware which is not compliant, and then typically what happens is the implementation is not a success. So even if they've taken into account all of the above and the biometric modality is not fit for purpose, they will struggle to have it installed. As always, biometrics, as with probably any niche sector, is a specialist role, and it's important to get the guidance from organizations like the Biometric Institute when you want to deploy something like this.
Yeah, thank you, Francois. I think that's a nice way to send the key message around this for the close of this meeting. I will add to that what we are seeing, and the Institute has been around since 2001, is a real hype and excitement around innovation and technology and biometrics. And we are starting to see biometrics in places where you really have to question what the business case is, and where you need to also ask the question, just because we can, should we really go down that path? The representative from the EU Data Protection Supervisor's Office in our GDPR seminar said, let's not forget that the technology is there to serve the human and not exploit the human. And I really found that was a good way to summarize our thinking on the responsible use of biometrics. I will close the meeting with that because we're right on the hour. I'm really pleased everyone could join us for this meeting. You are seeing on your screen there's a range of events coming up. While we do a lot of events, I'd like to remind people they are really our platform to share the experiences and to create thought-provoking dialogue on biometrics and identify gaps where our community needs to do more work, whether that is on standards, and we work with the standards organizations, or it's on research where we have our academics, or the privacy regulators where we have links, and the international organizations that help us to reach out into all kinds of areas of the world now. So thank you very much, and thank you to our speakers, and I will be in touch with the slides. My colleague Nikki will forward you a link where you can access these slides. If you want to find out about the guiding material, do drop us a note as well, and we'll let you know as well with what we do with the recording of the meeting, how we can make that available for anyone who couldn't join us today. So thank you very much, everyone. And just as I close, I will give you another little wave quickly here from London and from the Biometrics Institute, and we'll look forward to seeing you all very soon somewhere around the world. So safe travels and have a wonderful day or evening, and see you all very soon. Goodbye.